Imagine you're a physiologist in the early 1960s, running a strange little experiment. You lower an ordinary person's face into a basin of cold water and watch their heart rate on a monitor. Within seconds, without the person doing anything voluntary at all, their pulse drops. Blood retreats from their limbs and concentrates around their heart and brain. Their body, completely on its own, starts behaving like it's preparing for a deep, prolonged dive. Except this is a person who has never dived in their life, sitting in a lab with their face in a bowl. And here's the thing that should stop you cold. No other land mammal does this quite the way we do. Not chimpanzees, not gorillas, not a single one of our closest primate relatives shows anything close to this reflex, which raises a genuinely strange question that a small, stubborn group of researchers has been asking for over 60 years, and that mainstream paleoanthropology has spent almost that entire time trying very hard to make go away. What if, at some point in our deep evolutionary past, our ancestors spent a meaningful stretch of time in the water, not swimming occasionally like a chimpanzee crossing a river, actually living around it, depending on it, being shaped by it? Stay with me, because we're about to go very deep into one of the strangest, most stubbornly persistent rabbit holes in all of human evolutionary science. Before we get into the controversial part, let's appreciate something simpler. Humans are, by primate standards, bizarrely good in water. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, generally cannot swim at all and will actively avoid deep water even when it means missing out on food on the other side. Gorillas are the same. Most primates are, frankly, terrible in water, and evolutionarily speaking, that makes sense. Swimming is not a trivial skill for a mammal built for trees and open ground. It requires specific adaptations most primates simply never evolved, because for most of them, water was never a central part of daily survival. There are exceptions worth noting. Proboscis monkeys in Borneo are unusually capable swimmers and will cross rivers voluntarily, using a distinctive partial webbing between their toes to help propel themselves. And long-tailed macaques in parts of Southeast Asia forage for shellfish along the shoreline in a manner that looks almost eerily familiar. But these are isolated exceptions among primates generally defined by their discomfort in water, which makes the human case stand out even more sharply by comparison. Humans are the obvious outlier. Human infants, remarkably, show a reflexive breath-holding and paddling response when submerged before they've ever been taught to swim, a reflex that fades within months if not reinforced, but is unmistakably present at birth. That alone is strange enough to make researchers pause. The reflex I mentioned at the start has a name. It's called the mammalian dive response, and it was documented in careful physiological detail by researcher Per Schollander in the early 1960s, first in seals and whales, and then, to considerable surprise, in ordinary human test subjects as well. When your face contacts cold water specifically, your heart rate drops, your blood vessels constrict to preserve oxygen for your core organs, and in trained free divers, this response becomes dramatically more pronounced, allowing some individuals to hold their breath and dive to genuinely startling depths on a single lungful of air. This isn't something humans learn. It's something our bodies already know how to do, wired in at a level well below conscious control, and it shows up far more strongly in humans than in almost any other primate. Now stack a few more strange facts on top of that one. Humans are one of the only primates with a meaningful layer of subcutaneous fat distributed relatively evenly across the body, similar in placement, though not in thickness, to the blubber layer seen in aquatic and semi-aquatic mammals. Most land mammals carry fat internally, around organs, rather than in a smooth layer just beneath the skin. Human newborns are coated at birth in a waxy substance called vernix caseosa, and while its function is still debated among researchers, some have noted its similarity to protective coatings seen in certain aquatic mammal offspring. Humans have lost the dense body hair that virtually every other primate retains, while keeping a distinct, directional pattern of fine hair that some researchers have argued follows water flow lines consistent with reduced drag while swimming, an interpretation other scientists dispute vigorously. Our nostrils point downward rather than forward, as in most primates, arguably reducing water entering the nose while swimming face down. There's also the strange matter of hand webbing. Every human embryo briefly develops webbing between its fingers during gestation, tissue that is then normally broken down through a controlled process of cell death before birth. Occasionally, that process doesn't fully complete, and a small percentage of people are born with residual webbing between their fingers or toes, a condition doctors call syndactyly. Proponents of the aquatic hypothesis have pointed to the very existence of this embryonic webbing stage as suggestive, while critics correctly note that partial hand webbing appears during development in many mammals for entirely unrelated structural reasons, and its presence alone proves very little on its own. None of these traits, taken individually, proves anything, but taken together, they form a pattern odd enough that a British marine biologist named Alister Hardy couldn't stop thinking about it. In 1960, Hardy published a short, cautious paper proposing what would eventually become known as the aquatic ape hypothesis, the idea that at some point in human evolutionary history, likely in coastal or lakeside environments in Africa, our ancestors underwent a period of adaptation to a partially aquatic lifestyle, wading, swimming, and foraging in shallow water for food sources like shellfish, before returning more fully to a terrestrial existence. Hardy was a respected, credentialed scientist, and he knew exactly how this idea would land. He reportedly sat on the concept privately for decades before publishing, specifically because he anticipated the reaction it would get. He was right to worry. The hypothesis was picked up more enthusiastically by writer Elaine Morgan than by the paleoanthropological establishment, and Morgan spent much of her career arguing for it in a series of books starting in the 1970s, often pointing out, sharply, that mainstream evolutionary science had a long history of interpreting ambiguous evidence through assumptions about male hunting behavior while giving comparatively little serious attention to alternative explanations centered on foraging, wading, or gathering near water. Morgan was not herself a trained paleoanthropologist, which made it easy for critics inside the field to dismiss her as an outsider rather than engage seriously with every argument she raised, even as some of her broader critiques about unexamined assumptions in evolutionary storytelling were later echoed, in more measured language, by researchers working entirely independently of her. She gave public talks on the topic for decades, watched the scientific establishment largely close ranks against the idea, and never lived to see whether findings like the Bajau spleen study would eventually complicate the tidy dismissal her work had generally received. Mainstream paleoanthropology's rejection of the aquatic ape hypothesis has been, for decades now, close to unanimous, and it's worth being honest about why. There is no definitive fossil evidence placing early hominins in a sustained aquatic environment for the kind of timescale the hypothesis would require. Alternative, more conventional explanations exist for several of the traits used to support it. Subcutaneous fat could simply relate to thermoregulation or infant brain energy reserves rather than buoyancy. The dive reflex exists to some degree in many mammals as a general adaptation to any cold water immersion or breath-holding stress, not necessarily evidence of a specifically aquatic evolutionary phase. Anthropologist John Langdon published a detailed, point-by-point critique of the hypothesis in the 1990s. systematically working through each piece of supporting evidence and arguing that nearly all of it could be explained more simply through ordinary terrestrial adaptations, without needing to invoke any aquatic phase at all. Critics have also pointed out that the hypothesis, in its stronger forms, has occasionally been presented with more confidence than the underlying evidence actually supports. These are legitimate, serious scientific objections, and the overwhelming consensus among paleoanthropologists today remains that human evolution unfolded primarily in mixed savanna and woodland environments, not along ancient coastlines. And yet, the questions the hypothesis raises haven't fully gone away, largely because some of the physical evidence it points to keeps showing up in places researchers didn't expect to find it. In 2018, a researcher named Melissa Ilardo, then working with the University of Copenhagen, published a study that sent a small shockwave through the world of human evolutionary genetics. She had been studying the Bajau, a population of sea-dwelling people spread across parts of Southeast Asia, sometimes called sea nomads, whose traditional way of life revolves almost entirely around freediving for food, spending a significant portion of each day underwater without any breathing equipment at all. Using portable ultrasound equipment carried into remote coastal villages, Ilardo measured the spleen size of Bajau individuals and compared it to a genetically related but non-diving population nearby. The Bajau spleens were, on average, roughly 50% larger. This matters because the spleen acts as a biological oxygen reservoir, releasing a reserve supply of oxygenated red blood cells into circulation during breath holding, extending the amount of time a diver can safely remain underwater. Genetic analysis confirmed the enlargement was linked to a specific gene variant, one connected to thyroid hormone regulation, and that this variant appeared to have become more common in the Bajau population through natural selection, acting on a trait directly tied to prolonged underwater survival within a documented human population in measurable, recent evolutionary time. The Bajau are not the only human population whose way of life has revolved around sustained free diving for centuries. The Ama, traditional free diving harvesters found along parts of the coastlines of Japan and Korea, have practiced breath-hold diving for shellfish and seaweed for a documented history stretching back well over 1,000 years. Historically dominated by women divers who train from a young age and continue diving productively well into older age, a pattern researchers studying the group have found genuinely unusual compared to most physically demanding occupations. Physiological studies of experienced AMA divers have found measurable differences in resting heart rate, lung capacity, and dive response strength compared to non-diving populations in the same region, differences that appear to develop through a combination of intensive lifelong training and, plausibly, some degree of selection acting on the specific communities where this diving tradition has persisted across many generations. Neither the Ama nor the Bajau prove that all humans carry some latent aquatic evolutionary heritage waiting to be unlocked. What they demonstrate, repeatedly and independently in different parts of the world, is how readily the human body responds and adapts when a community organizes its entire way of life around sustained time in water, generation after generation. This doesn't prove the aquatic ape hypothesis in Hardy's original, ambitious form. The Bajau are a specific, relatively recent population whose diving lifestyle developed over centuries, not millions of years, and their genetic adaptation is a clear example of ordinary, well-understood natural selection acting quickly on a population under strong selective pressure, not evidence of some deep, universal aquatic phase in the broader human lineage. But it does establish something researchers on both sides of the debate now generally accept. The human body is demonstrably, measurably capable of adapting toward specialized aquatic performance at the level of organs and genetics under the right pressures and given enough time. The mechanism the aquatic ape hypothesis requires isn't biologically implausible. What remains genuinely contested is whether it happened at the scale and in the deep evolutionary window that Hardy originally proposed. There's also real, if more modest, archaeological evidence connecting early human populations to coastal environments far earlier than once assumed. At Pinnacle Point in South Africa, archaeologists have documented evidence of systematic shellfish harvesting by early Homo sapiens dating back roughly 164,000 years, among the earliest clear evidence of humans deliberately and repeatedly exploiting marine food resources. This doesn't require or prove an aquatic evolutionary phase in the way Hardy imagined, but it does establish that our ancestors were engaging seriously and skillfully with coastal food sources far earlier and far more capably than the old image of purely inland, purely terrestrial early humans would suggest. Picture a small group moving along the southern African coastline roughly 160,000 years ago, timing their movements to the tides the way their parents and grandparents had shown them. At low tide, a wide rocky shelf opens up, exposed and glistening, and the group fans out across it with practiced efficiency, prying shellfish loose with simple worked stones, reading the exposed rock pools for signs of what's hiding beneath the surface. Children wade in the shallow tide pools, already comfortable in water most land mammals would instinctively avoid. This wasn't occasional opportunistic foraging. The density and consistency of the shell remains found at sites like this suggest a returning, structured relationship with the coastline, generation after generation. Families who understood the rhythm of the tides as intimately as they understood the movement of game inland. So where does this leave the aquatic ape hypothesis today? Somewhere uncomfortable for people who prefer clean, settled answers, which is exactly why it refuses to disappear. The strongest, most sweeping version of Hardy's original idea remains outside mainstream scientific consensus, and the physical evidence for a distinct prolonged aquatic evolutionary phase millions of years ago is genuinely thin. But the individual pieces the hypothesis was built from, the dive reflex, the fat distribution, the demonstrated genetic plasticity toward diving performance in populations like the Bajo, the deep and unexpectedly early relationship between early humans and coastal food sources, haven't gone away and in some cases have gotten stronger with better tools and better data than Hardy ever had access to. Most researchers studying this today land somewhere careful and specific, not a full aquatic phase in the dramatic sense the hypothesis originally proposed, but a species with a genuinely unusual, genuinely underappreciated relationship with water running far deeper into its biology than casual observation would ever suggest. Sit with that for a moment. Every time you dive into a pool and feel your own heartbeat slow without meaning to. Every time an infant instinctively holds its breath the first moment its face touches water. Every time a Bajo diver disappears beneath the surface for minutes at a time on nothing but a held breath and an enlarged spleen shaped by genes selected for exactly this task. You are looking at a species whose relationship with water runs measurably deeper than most people ever stop to consider. Maybe it's ordinary convergent biology, the same pressures producing the same practical solutions again and again across unrelated species and unrelated populations, entirely explainable without any deep aquatic chapter in our shared evolutionary past. Or maybe a 60-year-old idea that respectable scientists still mostly won't say out loud at conferences is pointing at something real that just hasn't been fully proven yet, sitting in the uncomfortable space between confirmed science and dismissed fringe theory, where a surprising number of eventually important ideas have spent time before anyone took them seriously. Either way, the next time you hold your breath underwater and feel that strange automatic calm settle in, You're not imagining it, and you're not choosing it either. Your body has been quietly rehearsing for water for a very, very long time, running a program written long before anyone alive today existed to ask why. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. We make videos like this one every week about the strange, unresolved edges of human evolution, about what your body still remembers that science hasn't fully explained. If that's something you want more of, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of storytelling is worth keeping alive. See you in the next one.